All right, hi everyone. Welcome to LSE for this online event entitled 100 Great Black Britons, hosted by LSE Embrace, LSE's Black and Minority Ethnic Staff Network. This event is part of LSE's Black History Month program of events in the month of October. My name is Jeffrey Thomas, and I'm an assistant professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm very pleased in here to welcome Angelina Osborne, who will be discussing her book by her and her co-author, Patrick Vernon, authors of the newly released book, 100 Great Black Britons, to the LSE today. I'd like to share a bit more about the background of the two authors. So Angelina is an independent researcher and heritage consultant. She received her PhD in history from the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation, University of Hull in 2014. Her interests focus on Caribbean enslavement and pro-slavery discourses and the history of community and education activism. Patrick Vernon, her co-author, is a Clore Winston Churchill Fellow, a fellow at the Imperial War Museum, a fellow at the Royal Historical Society, and a former fellow for the Department of History of Medicine at Warwick University. Patrick was awarded an OBE for 2012 for his work tackling health inequalities for ethnic minority communities in Britain. Since 2010, he's been leading a campaign for Windrush Day, and in the 2018 kickstarted campaign for the amnesty for the Windrush generation as part of the Windrush scandal, which led to a government U-turn in immigration policies. So today, this event will take place in a conversational format requested by speakers. I've prepared a list of questions to ask our speakers so they can share more about the 100 Great Black Britons and more about the work that they do to empower Black people in the UK and beyond. We'll have a conversation for about 30 minutes with the authors, and from there, we'll open up the questions to the audience. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be submitted to myself, and I will pose as many questions as possible to the speakers, given the time constraints. Please let us know your name and affiliation. We're particularly keen to hear from our students and alumni, as well as incoming students. There's an opportunity to vote for specific questions that you would like to hear the answers to as well, so please use that. And this will help us to select questions to ask to the speakers. For those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is LSE Black History Month. This online event is being recorded and will hopefully be made into a podcast. As I mentioned before, there's a book that is attached to this event, 100 Great Black Britons. So please purchase your copy at the Pages of Hackney website or other places where these books are sold. A link will be shared in the Zoom chat later in the event. But now I'm delighted to begin our conversation. Welcome, Angelina, and congratulations on all the great success that you've had already with your book.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us to speak today.
Great. So I think the history of how this 100 Great Black Britons list, how it arose is very interesting. So can you tell us about the history of the other lists that preceded it and why this list was so important? And in essence, why did you write the book?
Okay, so first, before the book came into existence, we did a campaign back in 2003. The campaign was really a response to what actually had happened in 2002. In 2002, the BBC had led a national campaign to find out who was the greatest Briton of all time, and had invested considerable resources in putting together nominations, a national poll, as well as about 10 programs which were broadcast over 2 weeks. Each program was about an hour long and was presented by a celebrity who argued the case of 10 of these Great Britons, reasons why they should be voted greatest Briton of all time. What we noticed about the list of 100 people that had been nominated by the British public, was that there was only one person who was of African or Asian descent, and that person was Freddie Mercury, the former lead singer of Queen, who was born in Zanzibar, of Parsi heritage. Other than that, there were no people of African or Asian heritage that were featured on the 100 list. We felt that it was, a serious omission, a serious exclusion of the contributions, historical and contemporary, of African people, African and Caribbean people who have lived, have been in this country, in Britain, certainly since, in terms of a continuous presence, since the 16th century, since the Tudor period, possibly even before. And certainly there's plenty of archaeological evidence to determine, to prove that there were African people living in Britain, certainly as far back as the Roman period, and certainly there was a presence here in the medieval period. So we set about Patrick, it was Patrick's idea, it was he that was actually inspired to put together a list of 100 African and Caribbean people throughout history and contemporary to that period, to demonstrate that the BBC could have easily included African or Caribbean people in the list. But what it also told us, that it was about wider discussions around the erasures within British history, the treatment of history, of British history, I should say, as a really kind of a very narrow narrative, a narrow historical narrative that didn't seem to have room for people of African heritage. So the conception of 100 Great Black Britons was born in that period. And so a list was put together. Patrick asked me to assist with the researching and writing of the different 100 profiles, and we created a national campaign of our own to get people to nominate their greatest Black Briton.
Thank you. I think it's interesting the way that in the book you talk about the criteria you used to select your list and how it was different from the 100 Great Britons list. And you talked about resilience as one of the criteria and resistance. So I'm wondering, because your book spans such a large span of time, so there's nominees from the 16th century and before, and as well as nominees from today, like Stormzy. So I'm wondering, across time, do you see a common theme in the way that these nominated individuals have persevered in their careers and their lives? And is it different? Is the path to success different now than it has been in the past and with some of the earlier nominees?
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Patrick.
Hi there. So yeah, it's interesting because when we did the list back in 2004, our focus was actually making the case that Black people existed, and we were there. So we were looking for the first person, like the first, Black person to play for the English football team, the first Black person to do this, first Black. To me, we're looking the first of to make that. That was an argument we were making 17 years ago. So when we decided to put together the new campaign, which is reflected in the book, we moved away from the first. It's not good enough to be the first. It was about how have you used your privilege as a Black professional or whatever you are in the sector that we were looking at to make a difference for the community. And this is really, really important. So that's why some people have said, how come this person's not in the book or that person's in the book? Because we had a particular set of criteria why we were doing that. But there is a golden thread in all the people that were featured. Even though it's the book is like a biographical, historical book. I think the book could easily be on the shelf around self-help and motivation, because if you were to read the bios, you would see that people have overcome barriers, obstacles, and that's a common factor for everyone. Secondly, I think, and it doesn't really matter if they were in the 18th century or even today, all the people that we have featured have worked hard to the top of their profession or top of the field of work that they've been involved in. All of them have put themselves above the line, and all of them have used their privilege in a way to make a difference. So that is consistent with lots of the people that we have featured in the book, to me, in many ways.
Interesting. And I noticed in the book that you talked about the lack of Black history education in the UK and the emergence of supplementary schools to help educate people about these histories. What work has been done to impact schools in the UK? Can you talk a little bit more about potential changes to the curricula that you have seen or that you would like to see in conjunction with books like this?
The work in terms of changing the curriculum, unfortunately, remains at snail's pace. It's still a moment of continued negotiation, the continued back and forth between not only this current government, but preceding governments, both Conservative and Labour governments. What people have tended to do, as you alluded to in your question, is supplementary schools, which started in the 1960s by African Caribbean parents who were extremely concerned at the education their children were receiving in schools back then. They started these supplementary schools as a way to make sure that their children were conscious of their own history and heritage, which was sadly lacking in schools at that time. Many of these schools continue to do the work that they do. I'm associated, certainly, and worked with one up in my own area where I live in South London. What teachers also do is that many teachers have chosen to incorporate the history of Black Britons into their history teaching, regardless of whether it's itemized in the national curriculum. So there's always been those individuals that are doing the work, and often with, for example, when people do projects that are Heritage Lottery funded, they're often attached to these projects around Black history and heritage, education packs that are created and developed. So there's lots and lots of material out there that teachers can rely on to incorporate history into history of Black Britons into the history teaching. At this point, it still remains elective. It's not compulsory. So this is where we are. It's not written into the national curriculum. There has been some great work that's been done by wonderful teachers that's been introduced, and professors that's been introduced recently around the history of migration. So there's a lot that's been done around looking about the movement of Windrush generation individuals. So while there is no sort of official government acceptance or introduction of Black British history being taught in schools as a compulsory element of the history part of the national curriculum, people do continue to teach Black British history. Many people do, but as I said, it continues to be a challenge in terms of convincing Department of Education to introduce it as a compulsory element.
Yeah, I think this book, it really does take a step forward in that direction. It's very interesting discussions of politicians, athletes, doctors, and their different paths towards success. And speaking of Windrush, Patrick, I know you've been pivotal in addressing the Windrush scandal and supporting mental health initiatives in the Black community. Could you tell us a little bit more about that work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, the Windrush scandal, it's still slightly ongoing, but I mean, I suppose because of the work I've been doing, work with Angie over the years around documenting the Black presence through the 100 Great Black Britons and other projects I've been involved in around oral histories. It's given, it gives you, I think history is important. I think for people online, your students, if you have a sense of history and you do your research work, along with backed up with oral histories and stuff like that, it gives you a sense of confidence when you start to become a campaigner, an activist, because you know what you're talking about. It does help. So because I knew that history, and then plus I was involved, I met some of the people that were caught up in the Windrush scandal, sharing me their lived experience of how they were treated by the Home Office, and I just joined the dots. That's all I did, and that's what we've done with 100 Great Black Britain. We've just joined the dots. There's nothing kind of magical or innovative. It's just joining the dots, and then you make the case that this is the issue, these are the concerns. So when I joined the dots to recognise in the history of the immigration policy, history of legislation, and then the history of unjust treatment, I just joined the dots and then launched a petition, a campaign for amnesty for the Windrush generation, because essentially the government was saying to the Windrush generation, or the children who came to Britain undocumented. They were still British, but the government said, you haven't got documentation, so therefore you're not British, you're illegal immigrants. And so that was the crux of the whole issue around hostile environment policy. And so I simply said, they were British in the first place, so why are you taking away their status? And that's why I did the petition around amnesty. And I deliberately used the word amnesty because if I said, this is a campaign to regularize the status of people already British, then people will say, what are you talking about? I don't understand that. So if you use the word amnesty, it provokes a reaction, it provokes an emotional reaction about something's wrong here. Why, I suppose it worked because obviously, I mean, there's other things, other factors. There was a Mina gentleman who's writing, profiling the Windrushes in her for a good 8-9 months in the Guardian on a regular basis. There were organisations such as JCWI, Liberty, and other and lawyers raising their concerns on the impact of hostile environment as well. And then you had the Caribbean diplomats raising their concerns regarding the impact of the hostile environment. I mean, but it's only when I launched a petition that it crystallised, and it was then called the Windrush scandal, because I used the word the Windrush generation, a word that came from the work of the Windrush Foundation, led by Sam King and Arthur Torrington, who have been promoting the history of the Windrush generation, and I just used that as part of the campaign, basically, and then that kind of then led to a public reaction, because I think the average person in Britain said, hold on, these people are British, why is the government treating them in a shoddily way? And that's why I think it went beyond just simply the black community. It became a scandal, a national and even international scandal. I can remember being interviewed by CNN, and they said to me, Patrick, how would you explain the Windrush scandal to Americans? I said, yeah, very simple. It's like Donald Trump saying to the Italians, the Poles, go back home. What would be the reaction if you were told second, third generation Italians and Poles and Irish to go back home? That is the Windrush scandal in America.
That's a great summary and interesting. So along that same line, staying on that theme, I'm wondering, so I'm from the States with Guyanese roots, and reading this book has been fascinating to understand Black British history. What makes Black British identity unique as opposed to other Black identities globally?
I think it's the history, our history in terms of enslavement and colonization. It's a theme in terms of how our experience is often underpinned by that, usually always underpinned by that history. Now, for example, when you talk about the Windrush scandal, it's been discovered that the Windrush scandal didn't just happen. It didn't just happen as a consequence of the hostile environment immigration policy that was established, I think, in 2012 or 2014. From the moment that people decided to leave the Caribbean and settle in the UK after the Second World War, there was a concerted effort for that not to happen. Despite the establishment of the 1948 Nationality Act, which was Britain's way of trying to keep its empire together, or even its Commonwealth together, because it was inviting people from its former colonies, as they were slowly losing them, to live in Britain, to help rebuild Britain after the Second World War. People from the Caribbean were actually not invited. They were excluded from that, but they couldn't actually say, we actually don't want people from the Caribbean to come here. So if you read policy of Home Office policy, immigration policy from that period, you'll know that they did not want people to come here. So, and that sort of exemplified not only in that act, but the subsequent immigration acts that followed. The 1962 Immigration Acts, 1971, the 1982, they all consistently place further restrictions on the movement of people from the Caribbean and from Africa. So it's not, and then if you go even further back, for example, when there was the First World War, thousands of Caribbean men wanted to serve in the First World War. the British did not want them. The British imperial government did not want them to serve for a whole range of reasons. Mainly because main reason being they considered the war to be a white man's war, and they did not want black men to hold guns, to be armed. And consequently, when they eventually did allow the 16,000 men of the British West Indies Regiment to serve in the First World War, the vast majority of them were employed in sort of labor troops. They did not, they were not engaged in combat. So the history of Caribbean people, which is underpinned by slavery and colonialism, means that there's always been this sort of tension, and this tension certainly people the Caribbean population, African Caribbean population in Britain, certainly since post-war, let's say, has been underlined by this tension that has been sort of manifested itself in a whole range of different series of inequalities and discriminations that people continue to campaign against. And so I taught this past earlier term before this new term started, a course on Black Britain, and I called it Struggles and Triumphs, because it is a history of struggle. As a continued history of struggle. And everything that I sort of studied and read and presented to my students showed me that in terms of when we're thinking about, going back to your earlier question about criteria, the criteria, for example, for the Great Britons, that BBC campaign really sort of brought out a lot of people that people are very familiar with. Winston Churchill, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, Captain Cook, Queen Elizabeth I, all these periods that really sort of glorify sort of empire, okay, or beginnings of empire. So, and exploration, these so-called great and good. So I felt that, you know, we both felt that this criteria is not applicable to our narrative. Our narrative is one of struggle. So once we are able to transcend certain barriers and transcend certain struggles, I felt that that's what sort of identifies a person as a Great Black Briton, because of the consistent barriers that we have to overcome as part of our lived experience and our lived reality.
Interesting. And I'm wondering, so you both mentioned in different ways this idea that those nominees that have been nominated have used their platform to help elevate others and their communities. I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the examples of nominees who have used their platforms well, and also, if you do know, what have been the reactions of those who have been nominated? How their reactions to being nominated led to potential new progress forward?
Okay, so I mean, there are quite a few people in the book that we've talked about how they've used their privilege and experiences. So I mean, I'm sure Angie, we've got. I mean, the question you're asking, the question we had saying, who's our favourites? That's what it boils down to.
Yeah.
Who do you think? So I mean, I've got personal favourites, and you know, I'm sure Angie will share hers. Mm-hmm. But before I answer that question, it's important to recognise that we did a campaign in 2004. We launched a brand new campaign in 2020. So the people that's not featured in the new campaign and in the book are still Great Black Britons. And the book, the campaign of 2020, which is reflected in the book, tells you that the Black experience has changed. It's like a barometer of the here and now. If we were to literally use the same people that we featured 17 years ago, we'd be heavily criticised for saying nothing's changed. There's no new role models. Where do people fit in that? So we have to reflect that people have moved on, but people that were featured in 2004. So, for example, Zadie Smith was featured in 2004. She's not in the book and its latest campaign because there's no other writers, but she's still a Great Black Briton. But we have to go with the time. I mean, ideally, this should be like volume 2. Maybe we should have that volume 1, or it's a bit like Hollywood. You have a pre-sequel. How would that work, Angie? Could we do a pre-sequel?
Well, I don't see why not.
You know, maybe we have to do that. Talk to our publishers. Can we do a pre-sequel? But there are some people. I mean, for me personally, one of my favourites is Bernie Grant, the late Bernie Grant MP for Tottenham. And I'm lucky, I'm a vice chair of the Bernie Grant Trust, and the Bernie Grant Trust has a custodianship of his archives. His archives are kept at the Bishopsgate Institute in Liverpool Street in London. And if you go to his archives, which obviously it's about his life, but it's about all the things he did as an activist, heavily involved in the trade union movement, as a trade unionist. His work as a leader of Haringey Council, and then become the MP for Haringey, and all the work that he did in Haringey on Broadwater Farm, Stop and Search. Then his international work, his campaign around reparations, his campaigns around fostering greater relationships between African Americans and the Black British community. He went to America quite a few times, met with the Congressional Caucus, and did the same thing in Africa, did the same thing in the Caribbean. He spent a lot of time doing work in Europe. So he went 10 times over and beyond in terms of his privilege. And one of the things I forgot to mention, by the way, a lot of people that we featured died. Most of them didn't reach 60. A lot of people have died because of and this is one of the consequences when you're pushing yourself, or you're campaigning, or you're doing something in your profession. It has an impact on your life expectancy. This is really important. I mean, Bernie Grant died just over in his early 50s. Yeah. Same with Claudia Jones. A number of people died in their 40s and 50s, and so that's why their achievement in a short space of time that they're on this planet is even more significant as well. I could go on and talk about other people. I'll let Andy talk about her fate.
Yeah, who are your favorites, or who would you like to see at a dinner party?
Okay, so I would just like to say, first of all, Jeff, you mentioned at the beginning of the talk that you have Guyanese roots. Your family's from Guyana. Okay, so you may or may not know, for example, the social theorist Paul Gilroy. His mother was from Guyana, a Guyanese, and she was Beryl Gilroy, leading psychotherapist and author. So I'll just put that out there. But she also, I would say, is a Great Briton. So just to throw that out there, if you didn't know about Dr. Beryl Gilroy. So did you know about her?
I did not, actually. Yeah. Okay,
so that's Paul Gilroy's mother came here from Guyana in 1951. You asked about my own personal. I have so many. I tend to sort of refer. Who I love is Olive Morris, to invite to a dinner party, and Claudia Jones. Both are my personal heroines. When I've read about both of them, I read Cara Boyce Davis's Left of Karl Marx, which is such an excellent political biography of Claudia Jones, and just to look at her own sort of political development as from a young child who first got involved in the case against the Scottsboro boys in the 1930s. These were young African-American boys who had been accused of raping white women, and they had been sentenced, I think, to death, and they had been this huge campaign. So that was one of the early campaigns that she got involved in. She was a very key member of the Communist Party of the United States, and saw the sort of links between how communism could help African-American women and the poor in terms of their own not only self-actualization but also their political development, helping them to develop their own agency. She was deported from the United States because of her communist activities, and she, as I said, she was a leading member. She was an editor of their magazines. She was really a big important leading figure. She during the McCarthy era, she was deported to the United Kingdom because she was born in Trinidad, and so she was a British subject, officially a British subject. They felt that she would be able to be monitored more closely if she was in the UK. She hit the ground running in the UK by immediately seeing it was another site of struggle. she saw that people who had been arriving from the Caribbean and settling in the UK in the 1950s were really having a really difficult time with the colour bar, with discrimination in housing, education, employment, and started one of the West India Gazette and Asian Times in 1950, I think early 1959. And also is one of the creators of the first manifestation of the Notting Hill Carnival, hosting it in St Pancras Town Hall in January of 1959, because she also, not only was she thought that it was important to have, politics was important, but culture, one's celebration of one's culture is also important. So there are all these different things that need to come together in terms of our own sort of well-being. It's as Patrick has mentioned, it's a knowledge of our own history and heritage, our culture, knowing our culture, having good political activism, good people around you. These kinds of things are helping with our well-being, especially when we are in this kind of environment, for want of a better word, a hostile environment, certainly as it was for many people in the 1940s and 1950s, and even earlier than that, because we know that there were communities here in the 1930s. But actually, as I said, a continuous presence since the 16th century. So she's totally a heroine of mine, who I admire greatly, as well as I said, Olive Morris, who tragically died of cancer at age 27, but packed so much into those 27 years, becoming such a leading activist, a grassroots activist in Brixton in South London, where she grew up. She wasn't born, she was born in Jamaica, and also in Manchester, where she was doing her degree in the University of Manchester, starting the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent. Many of the members that left of that group have gone on to do wonderful, wonderful work, such as Suzanne Scaife and Stella Dadsey, become what we call them scholar activists. So her legacy of working with women, just ordinary women, in helping them navigate their own lives in the 1970s, is incredibly inspirational to me.
Okay, excellent. I think that's definitely a good place for readers to start once they do pick up the book. Great, so thanks definitely for these insightful first comments. Now we'll transition to taking some questions from the audience. So I'll read those to you all. Looks like we have a few questions on the same theme. And this is 100 Great Black Britons. I think it seems like some are curious about, so there's one question from Arola, who says, there's been 100 selected, but there are over 1,000 nominations. Is there a place where others can access the other 900 nominations? And then related to that, Jeremy Zimmerman asks, who is #1 in the book? So you don't explicitly make a ranking, but two questions related. Can people access the full list of 1,000 nominations, and who would you say is #1?
Well, yes, I mean, the book, towards the end of the book, we have listed all the nominees, all the 1,000, as well as the list from the 2004 campaign as well. So it's all there in the book. It's there in all good bookshops like Pages. So get the book. That's the answer. Get the book, and then you'll know. When we did the campaign 17 years ago, we were kind of replicating what the BBC did. So we had a public nomination, public vote. We ranked people. We had a ranked order, and people voted for Mary Seacole as the greatest Black Briton of all time. So we had British. So you like Mary Seacole, Winston Churchill, take your pick. This time round, we didn't do that. We just focused on nominees. We didn't put them any particular rank order at all. So because we wanted to recognise that all of them were great. I mean, even the people that didn't make the cut are still great. You know, I mean, the book could have been called 1,000 or 2,000, 5,000 Great Black Britons, but you know, we had limitations in terms of time and also the concept itself. But you know, my answer to anyone, you know, we don't have the monopoly on this, by the way. So if you want to do your own book and campaign, and people have done that. After the last campaign we did, there was a whole creation of lists of people in different sectors and professions. So if that inspires people to do more research work, that's fantastic. That's great. Just do it. You know, we'll support me in something. If we have time, we can support you. But that's what we've done. And I'm sure people in each sector, in each sector of the economy, you could easily have 100 in law, in medicine, in politics, in civil society, and engineering. You name it. You could have individuals, you know, and there have been some lists covering those sectors as well.
Okay, excellent. And we have a question from Owet at Cambridge, and they say that I work in diversity and inclusion. How could you imagine diversity and inclusion practitioners like myself utilizing the book to spark conversation or create real change in the workplace?
It's interesting. Go ahead, Angie. Sorry.
Oh no, you go on, Patrick, please.
No, you after you.
I was just going to say that within the book, they're all profiles. They're profiles of different individuals about but it's not merely their biography. I've tried, what I have done, I haven't tried to, I have put them in their context, in their social, political, and cultural context. So for example, I did a profile on Dame Sharon White. Now, prior to her becoming chair of the John Lewis Group, she was a very senior civil servant. Okay, so as a senior civil servant, I wanted to understand how many people, African and Caribbean heritage, are senior civil servants. And they're very, very few. There are lots of African Caribbean people working in the civil service, but the vast majority of them are in very junior levels. So that's a question you can ask yourself. In terms of diversity and inclusion, those are the questions you ask. What can we do, for example, to attract or to support people within the civil service, for example, to help them, to support them to move up from being maybe a junior up to very senior positions. So if people are conscious of what the situation is, then maybe they can have these more important discussions about how to make their workplace more inclusive.
So just to add on and build on what Andrew said, I do a lot of work around equality diversity. I've been advised in organisations. So I see the book, like other books that have come out, like Carla's book, like Rennie Lodge's book, like Afia Hirsch's book, and Dave Oliver. It's a resource. It's a resource that people can use around having those difficult conversations around lack of representation at senior level. That's the first thing. I think it's also a conversation about people's lived experiences. And one of the key issues, particularly around Black staff working in any sector, is that they have to deal with microaggressions. They've been held back in their career development, and people want to be inspired. And hopefully, the book will inspire people. And some of the people that were featured in the book actually have done talks and speaking engagements, sharing their own experiences around navigation as well. So I hope the book, I said before, the book could be on the self-help shelf, also around motivation and lessons as well. So hopefully it could be used in that way. But I think it could be a resource to have those conversations as well.
Excellent. And I see a related question, so from Francesca, an LSE alumna, who asks to both, and especially Dr. Osborne, will there be an end to this toxic environment from racism, discrimination, and leaving Black history out of the curriculum? I'll tack on my own end to that conversation. How do you see this book speaking to the protests against racial injustice of this new generation in that sense as well? So do you see an end, so the question being, do you see an end to this racism, and in terms of curriculum, and then also in terms of activism in the modern day?
No, I don't. I think at the end of the day, I hate that comment. The onus isn't on us to make the changes. The onus, I feel, is on the people who are in control of, the white people. I think it's really down to them. Activism will not end. I read a book recently by Ibram Kendi called Stamped from the Beginning. It's about the history of racist ideas in the United States. And in the introduction, he talks about racism is, as anti-racism evolves, so does racism. They both evolve and they change, and they take on different forms. Especially racism takes on many different forms that we have to learn to identify and to dismantle. And that's the challenge that we face today, is that that racism and racist thought tends to manifest and evolve into things that we do not appear to be obviously racist ideas. So that's the challenge that we have. In terms of activism, activism is our best hope and best defense, I feel. We are in it for the long haul. It may not happen in our lifetimes, even though that might sound like a really depressing thing. But I sometimes feel like the one of the most hopeful thing is that as long as we're alive, as long as we are living, that we can continue to challenge what's happening. Yeah, that's really my answer. We have to just keep on keeping on, really.
So what I've done, I'm not going to answer that question because I've actually written a whole blog on this issue around fighting for our rights, traumatization and mental health. So I've just put it into the chat. I've just written it for Policy Press, and please read and see what you think.
Excellent. Yeah, so Patrick has posted his answer to that in the chat, or his article relating to that in the chat, www.transformingsociety.co.uk. Excellent.
Yeah, we are tired, we're fatigued, we're tired.
And I have a question from Everina, who says, beyond resilience, what are the other common qualities, behaviors, or skills shared across the top 100? And do you think that there are new skills required of young Black Britons compared to the prior generation?
I mean, I think I gave some examples of the golden thread, the qualities, but I think what could you learn if you're a young person? And I mean, actually, there's some people that you can learn from who are in the book. If you look at Stormzy, Lewis Hamilton, for example, you know, they've used their, not only have they used their privilege, they've actually used it in a way to raise issues around race. I mean, you know, for someone like Lewis Hamilton, maybe it may, if we did the book maybe 5-6 years ago, campaign 5, it may not have been featured, even though he was still a world top racing driver. It's not enough being a world top racing driver. It's how you use privilege. He is one of the most elite sports in the world. Literally, it's a multi-millionaire's toy to have those fast cars. You know what I mean? He's in that space, and the very fact that he can raise issues around racism, discrimination in that space, no different to Naomi Campbell in the fashion world. And people might think, oh, they're out there making money and stuff like, yeah, of course, there's that side of it. But the very fact they're actually raising those issues, and like Naomi Campbell, she was heavily, I mean, I can remember Piers Morgan called her a chocolate soldier years ago. I don't even remember that. A really derogatory expression, basically, you know. But she's been campaigning behind the scenes for many years around racism in the fashion world, and so is Lewis Hamilton. So yeah, so I think one of the key lessons that we can learn is you don't have to make loads of money and have a celebrity status like Big Brother House and all those TV reality shows. You still can make a difference in your space, no matter how it's limited in that space. So I think that's a key lesson that we can learn. I mean, if you compare them to the likes of Equiano, he didn't have that platform. He was. Maybe correct me, Angela. Was Equiano actually invited into Parliament to make a presentation?
No, he was never invited, but he always attended. He and other Black political activists, they collectively call themselves the Sons of Africa. They regularly attended the parliamentary debates around the abolition of the slave trade. They regularly would read about what was going on in the Caribbean, what was going on in Africa. They were extraordinarily well informed. They would write to sympathetic MPs, people who were attached to politics. So that was the type of, he used his platform in remarkable ways when you consider that even in that period, that the position of an African in Britain was extraordinarily precarious in terms of the fact that if a white person decided they wanted to just kidnap you and put you on a ship bound for the colonies, for the West India colonies, they could do that. So, Equiano always carried his freedom papers with him all the time. And I imagine all free people who lived in Britain, Black people lived in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, carried their papers with them to prove that but sometimes it didn't even matter. It was irrelevant, but whether you had them or not, people would take you anyway. And it's only if you had the presence of mind to contact somebody who was, if you had somebody like a Granville Sharp who always wanted to take, argue the status of people, African people in Britain, somebody was going to contact the authorities to make sure that it didn't happen. It did happen. So Equiano is an extraordinary individual living in an era where the position of Black people was so precarious that and what he was able to accomplish within that space, how he was able to adapt and to accomplish so much is really quite remarkable. I think it can't be overstated how remarkable Equiano and others like him were.
Along those same lines, since we have two experts on the history here, let me ask this question from Annette, who says, could you discuss the history of the British colonies and slavery? And then related to that, in the US, there's an assumption that if people like Kamala Harris has Black Caribbean roots, that does not mean they're descendants of slaves. So the question is about history of slavery in the British colonies, and then also about Caribbean identity in relation to the Black identity.
Okay, so that's a really, really big subject. You have to be a bit more specific about what you want me to talk about in slavery in British colonies. But I'll just say that, Britain started to acquire colonies in the Caribbean in the early 17th century after seeing how fabulously wealthy and powerful countries like Spain and Portugal were becoming, and like other European countries, they wanted a slice of that. Certainly, 1562 to 64 were the first voyages by Hawkins during the Elizabethan era into the capture and enslavement of African people. But they really started to kick it off in the 17th century, which was first underwritten and supported and financed by the royal family. Okay, so James I. Charles I, James I, and subsequent monarchs after. It's such a huge subject. We're talking about the Caribbean being in a literal state of war from within and from without. Without that, I mean other European powers attempting to take those colonies during times of conflict, but also from within, because enslaved people did not accept their condition passively. There were constant rebellions and revolts and attempts to take the lives of white colonists consistently throughout the period of enslavement, as well as in places like Jamaica and Suriname. You had the Maroons, which they caused a heck of a lot of trouble for the authorities in both of those colonies. So you're asking, I can't in 30 seconds or a minute say more than that. But in terms of the question of Kamala Harris, mother was from India, I understand, and her father was an economist from Jamaica. So of course, as her father was from Jamaica, he is the descendant, or was the descendant, of enslaved Caribbean Jamaicans, Caribbean Africans. There's no real dispute there. If somebody's saying that she has not got enslaved ancestry, then they really don't understand the history of Jamaica. They don't understand the history of the Caribbean. Because these were not societies with slaves, they were slave societies. They were, the majority of people who lived in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, for example, Black people outnumbered white people something like 16 to 1. Okay, so and that's it. That's the deal with Kamala Harris. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I add to that a bit about Kamala Harris? If you look at the history of African Americans, there has been that relationship between a lot of people from the Caribbean going to America at the turn of the last century, especially to places like Harlem and Philadelphia, and all the kind of African Americans that you talk about who are great. They've all got Caribbean ancestors. And you have this Americanization process. Once you arrive in America, everyone's American. It's not different in Britain. You have to kind of justify that you're British. But in America, everyone's American, more or less, apart from indigenous First Nation people, the way they're treated. But that's not a story. But everyone's American.
Yeah,
so,
Malcolm X's mother was from Grenada.
Yeah, Malcolm X. I mean, actually, if you were to look at the key heroes and sheroes of African American history, they've all got Caribbean roots, basically. First, second, third generation, basically. And for even the most successful African Americans, I think I met the person that runs Howard University. He's got Caribbean roots. Everyone's got Caribbean roots in America, but because they speak with American accents, they automatically think they're all American. But there's a very strong relationship between Caribbean and influence. And if you look at the history of the Harlem Renaissance, heavily influenced by Caribbean people, no two ways about it, big time. You know what I mean? So I think we have to acknowledge that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think it's sometimes unclear how those links were spread. And so we have a related question from Annette that says, I'll pick one part of the question. Can you speak to this moment of converging pandemics as a critical catalyst for us across the diaspora to reimagine Pan-African futures that center around human dignity and equity? So can you speak to the pandemic in relation to the diaspora?
That sounds like a good question for an essay.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Isn't it? I mean, discuss. I mean, that is brilliant. Maybe that should be the next Zoom call. Maybe. Now, seriously, that is it's a big topic. I mean, I'm into Afrofuturism. I don't know if you're anyone to Sunrise, George Clinton, all that kind of stuff. Janelle Ray. I think what you talk to me, if I was looking at that question, is what kind of future do we want to imagine? And obviously, if you look at the Pan-African project, which happened, a lot of it was happening in London. Again, we've featured quite a few people in the book that were involved in that Pan-African project, like George Padmore and others in the book. That was a project that was emerging in Britain in interwar years, because people came over from Africa. They came over from London was like a melting pot, a metropolis of talent, black talent from the Caribbean and from Africa, and everyone was saying, "Hold on, we want independence." So that was the start of that. But if you kind of roll the clock now forward, in terms of the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic, I had a phone call this morning from a good friend of mine, and she said, "Patrick, don't take that COVID drug when it comes to the market. Don't touch it, because there's an African that has already designed an anti-COVID drug from Madagascar, but he's not been given the recognition." So this is another conversation that everyone's having on, about how do we create our own futures, how do we have our own autonomy. And obviously the big issue for Africa is that the pandemic hasn't hit Africa in the way compared to America and Britain and Brazil, because people are, with limited resources, many are able to keep it down. I mean, something's been a bit draconian, what's been happening, let's face it, in South Africa, and more recently, what's been happening in Nigeria, very draconian, what's been happening there. But it's about what kind of future do we want to imagine? I think that's the key question that we need to ask ourselves. Again, going back to the book, a lot of people that we featured in the book were having a world view of where did Black people fit in the world. And that is an ongoing conversation that we still need to have, basically.
Great. So I see we're almost wrapping up. So I'll just give a few rapid fire questions we have about the book. So the first is, will you produce learning resources for children or young people based on the book? And also, are you pushing to have your book taught in school curriculums?
Definitely yes to the second one. The second question, there is a campaign that was spearheaded by Yvonne Davis, a former head teacher. She started a GoFundMe campaign to raise enough money to have 100 Great Black Britons in every, I believe it's every secondary school, every secondary school in the UK. At this moment of speaking, Lambeth Council purchased enough books, I think well over 100 books, to put in every school in their borough, in the schools in their borough. So that's an ongoing sort of campaign that we hope that will come to really good fruition. Children's book, that's definitely I think there's scope for that, isn't there, Patrick? There's scope.
Absolutely, yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, the feedback we've had already is how can that book be made? I mean, into a children's book for different key stages. How can you have a nice colour, make it colourful images? So preschool stage, key stage 1 to 4. So obviously it's a conversation we need to have with our publishers. The more you buy the book, everyone, the more that will help our case.
Excellent. And so that's available at stores and online. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Lots of independent bookshops are stocking it, as well as the major bookshops as well. So certainly buy the book, but certainly support small bookstores as well, please.
Excellent. Well, I just want to say it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you all. And it's been a great pleasure for us to hear what you've had to say, Angelina and Patrick. Thanks very much for taking part. And we're grateful for your time and your busy schedules, promoting this book and doing other things. Before we sign off, remember to purchase your copy of 100 Great Black Britons from Pages of Hackney website or other websites where it's available. And so,
thank you very much indeed. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you,
Thank you
and
so
have
much.
a great day, everyone.
great, thanks, guys.
Oh, am I still there? Okay.
Well,
Oh, stop my video.